Hello, welcome back to No Code Week, brought to you by Startup Starter. We're a smart community for startups, investors, and service providers, a one-stop shop for entrepreneurship. Today, I have the pleasure of sitting down with the co-founder and co-CEO of a very special company that you guys, I'm sure, have seen all throughout the market in the last years make a lot of noise. They're helping people, everyday people, no coders, business owners, build products and bring them to life just through visual language. Without further ado, I want to bring to the stage Emmanuel Straschnov, co-founder and co-CEO of Bubble.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Hey, how are you today?
Very good.
Yeah? Where are you joining us from?
From New York, actually.
Oh, cool.
We haven't moved to the islands or anywhere.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
Maybe at some point when it's a little bit nicer when the time is coming.
It's nice to be home, whatever is going on. And New York is actually fine right now.
Yeah. Like, actually, I've considered making the move. You know, like it feels lively, and I hear that like now it's a good time to get a rent.
Yeah, actually, great deals.
Yeah. Okay, keep that in mind. Cool. Well, very excited for you to join us. Bubble has been all over the place, really like hard to ignore in years to come, the last few years. But there's also a big story behind it of how it came out to be and long years, right? Because I think a lot of the no-code companies started coming up in recent time.
Yeah, we started in 2012, so it's been almost 9 years now. Actually, more than 9 years if you think about the first line of code that was committed to in GitHub for the Bubble project. So
yeah, at the time, I think it wasn't called no-code, but were you guys pioneers in that space?
We were pioneers in the recent wave of that redefined a little bit what no-code should be. It was not called no-code at that point. The way we were framing it ourselves was visual programming. I think no-code was coined by an investor in New York. That said, the reason I hesitated a little bit when you were asking whether we were pioneers is I think, no-code is basically at the root of what technology is about since the very beginning of technology. And people have forgotten that a little bit because now there is a new space and it's cool, and it's great, don't get me wrong. But if you think, what was Macintosh, what was Windows versus MS-DOS? It was a visual interface to replace a command line, right? It's exactly what no code is. That's exactly what we do.
Fair.
Before MS-DOS, you would type something to edit text, then Windows came, you double click and you can do something, right? The reason why this is important is what we're trying to do now with Bubble and no code in general is actually something that many companies, including the most famous ones, Microsoft being the biggest name that comes to mind, have tried to do for decades. Like the idea of taking something that is impossible, difficult to do and requires code and turn that into something accessible and easy, that idea is not new at all. And that I think is the idea at the core of all the history of computing and personal computing in particular, and like business computing. But of the recent era, yes, I would say we're one of the earlier ones.
But wouldn't you say that if we look at kind of the timeline of when inventions come into play and how they influence, right, kind of the rest of the world, that no code is one of those things that you can say, okay, well, now looking back in these last few years and even that movement, it will enable, right? It'll create just a boom. Also, the timing is just great with what happened last year, people being at home. You know, our thesis startup starts that every business now an internet business, right?
Yep.
So
yeah, so I think the main difference between what was going on in the 80s, 90s, and even 2010 and today is that the internet is everywhere. And so now it is actually viable to start a business literally from your bedroom with a Wi-Fi connection, which even like 15 years ago was not necessarily possible. And that is because, you know, even services we use, like Amazon Web Services, for instance, that gives you access to servers. Now, I've never seen a server in my life, and I hope I will never see one because, you know, I trust Amazon to deal with that. And what we're adding on top of that is the same thing, enabling people to start companies without, you know, looking at code is what we offer. But what I mean is, for no code to really explode and for the creator economy to start embracing it as a creation tool, we had to have the infrastructure in place to be able to do that in a purely remote way and outsourcing a lot of the layers of the stack. And it took some time. That's why I mean, there is a reason why it started taking off in 2019.
Fair enough. And now let's kind of get to the story. We don't want to hear this because it's a very interesting one, right? You were born in France, came to the US, you were a management consultant beforehand. So it's kind of a long story. Can you tell us a bit about, you know, your background and how you came here?
Yeah, I never thought I would be a software entrepreneur, actually. So it kind of happened randomly. I was very French, actually. And so as a very French person, I always wanted to work for the government. And effectively, that's what I did. I went to the right schools in France to be working for the government. That said, I already had something for, first of all, mathematics, which is a very traditional track in France. And I had something for coding because I grew up in the countryside where I didn't have that much to do except doing things like learning how to code. Sure. That was very different technologies. It was under MS-DOS, you know, quick basics, this kind of things. That was like 25, 26 years ago. But, you know, at the end of the day, it hasn't changed, which is precisely, by the way, why Bubble needs to exist. You know, it needs to change. Like, come on, we can't be building things the same way I was doing that when I was a teenager.
Sure.
And so after school, I was about to join the government. And then I decided that I wanted to see the world a little bit. And having an interest in China from my parents had both lived in China before and met in Beijing. I wanted to spend a few years in China. And so that was my consulting experience there.
Got it.
The deal was that I was supposed to go back to the government after that. I was just delaying my entry to the government. And then I would say that's kind of when things started going off track and wrong because I didn't follow that plan. After 3 years there, started feeling that the government might not be exciting enough and I wanted something a little bit more fast-paced, you know, to change. So that led me, and I wanted to discover the US, to which I had like very little exposure so far. And so I applied to business school. I got into Harvard for my MBA. And that's while at Harvard that slowly actually kind of came naturally that entrepreneurship became obvious. Like it became obvious to me it was the right path for me. But it's something that happened very slowly and subtly. And then the actual partnership with Josh and Bubble kind of happened completely randomly because it was on our first, we decided to partner on our first coffee meeting. So that's a pretty special thing. But I would say the evolution to entrepreneurship felt natural. The opportunity itself wasn't expected.
And what was it like? I've had a few friends that are management consultants that once they transition, it's like, well, you're used to like theoretical and like kind of doing homework in a way, right? But then when it's time to actually kind of start getting started, you realize like, well, a lot of things that I knew, the assumptions that I made, now I don't really transfer the same. You come from a different school of thought. What was that like for you?
So I think the fact that I was in consulting in China made my consulting experience very different and prepared me much better to managing the chaos that and the ambiguity that entrepreneurship brings to you.
Sure.
So my experience in consulting was a bit special because I worked at a firm, like it's one of the major international firms, but turns out the partnership they had in China was very Chinese. So it was all mainland Chinese partners. And so all the clients were Chinese companies. And at the same time, I was there when the Lehman Brothers crisis hit in 2008. And so all international firms were basically cutting their consulting budgets. So I was basically thrown on Chinese projects for Chinese companies in Chinese. And my Mandarin was decent. It still is decent, like I can communicate, but I certainly wouldn't pretend that I had like a very strong business Mandarin. And so since the beginning of my work, I had to do the homework that you do as a consultant, doing all the slides and everything, but always doing them with a feeling that I was never 100% sure that I was doing right, what I was doing right, or what I was even understanding the context and what I was asked to do right. Because I wouldn't pretend my Chinese was like, okay, I understand every single thing I hear. Turns out most of the time I was mostly right, and so it was okay. But being forced to deal with this ambiguity constantly is actually something that turned out to be very valuable. Fast forward 4 years later when I was at Bubble, because even though I did some programming as a kid, I went very far from technology for many, many years. And when I started working with Josh, it was clearly identified that Josh would be the technical person of the company. I would be the business person. And pretty quickly, it turned out that there was no room for a business person until our product was good enough. And so I had to start coding again. And so I was thrown in that code base that Josh had started working on, where I could almost make the joke, it looked like Chinese to me at first, like a very foreign language, and I had to grow in it and everything. And that turned out to be a very useful skill.
Sure. I'm just risk-taking, always kind of just jumping into it. And fair. I think I've had a few friends that kind of go through the same story that, hey, we're starting something and now like I'll be the COO and I'll just do operations, but it's 3 of us. There's real no need for operations. We need to really work on building something first. So I hear you. Okay. So then you leave China, you come to the US, you go to Harvard. Congrats. You get out, and did you start working somewhere, or was it just Bubble immediately kind of the idea came? What was that like?
So I was looking for a job after school. I mean, I interned in fashion over the summer. So I did a little bit of a stunt there for a few weeks. And then I went back to school for my second year and graduated in May. Didn't line up a job at that point because I didn't feel I was mature enough in my soul searching process to find the right job after school. And so I waited long enough. And so at that point, I started being more clear that I wanted to be working on some technical product in software. Never thought I would be technical, so I was looking at business development jobs and stuff like this. And I actually had found a BD role at a pretty cool startup in New York that I was very happy about. And the day before I had to give a response to that job, to that company, I eventually ended having coffee with Josh, with whom I had been introduced a couple of weeks prior to this, but I was not in New York at that point. And back then it was not fashionable to talk too much on Skype, people were expecting to meet in person. Sure. It was the old world, right? Yeah. And so I met him at this coffee shop, who is telling him, great to meet, but I have my job offer that is expiring tomorrow. I'm going to take it. It's actually taking care of my immigration situation, which if we have foreigners in the audience, it's something always pretty stressful for non-citizens.
Sure.
Or non-permanent resident. And we talked and for probably almost 3 hours. And at the end, he was like, well, do you want to give it a shot? And I said, yes. So I didn't say yes immediately. I wanted to check a few things. I wanted to check, am I really going to do something crazy in terms of immigration? Because at some point there are hard rules you have to abide by. Yeah. So I asked advice to some people, and turned out they told me there was a way, and there it was a way. I mean, I managed to stay, and I started working on Bubble with them. It was not called Bubble at that point, so it took a little bit of time to come up with a name.
And what was the meeting like? What was the coffee like? What were you guys talking about? Just let's discuss ideas, see if we can come up with something.
So it was already his idea, actually. He already had started working on this. It was very early on, and he had an early prototype. So we talked about that, but then quickly we started talking about different things. He was a philosophy major from college. I used to write even though I went to a math school, I used to write some philosophy myself in French. So we're discussing that, discussing like random things, like kind of the conversation went in different directions.
Yeah.
Honestly, I don't remember, it was like 9 years ago, but I would say probably only 30 or 40% of the chat was about what ended up becoming Bubble, and the rest was things,
Yeah. So you guys
and that's kind of what you want, right? You don't want a purely professional brainstorming session.
Of course.
Because if you think about it, we didn't know each other at all. Like we could have been highly non-compatible.
Mm-hmm.
And,
no,
9 years later, here we are. So.
No. Cool. Okay. Then you guys leave the meeting, you decide, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to join this guy that's got a interesting product. And the idea was already that we're going to bring like visual language programming. Was that what it was starting?
Yeah, the idea is that we would enable non-technical founders to start companies on their own. So you have to put that back in the context of 2012, where it was the beginning of the startup era, where people wanted to build marketplaces for everything. People started realizing the potential of moving a lot of interactions to the web, whether it's social networks, or like people designers gathering and finding designers, and product managers and designers is kind of like gathering, or marketplaces like Airbnb type platforms. And so everybody was looking for a software engineer, like especially in New York. And we just felt like a lot of the ideas that these people were trying to build were actually not truly innovative from a technical standpoint. At the end of the day, if you start uploading pictures of people on Airbnb, like it's become a geolocation dating website. You can see people, see their picture, not match, that's a feature that's missing, but send messages and everything. So we felt like there is something wrong there. Like engineers are in very, very short supply. They're paid extreme amounts of money. Back then it was true, even more true today, to do something that is actually not truly value adding for most of the startups out there. Now, you have some companies like Bubble or some others that do much more like sophisticated things where the value they're creating is through the code they write. But I would argue that something like Airbnb, the value they create is not through the code they write. It's more through their marketing approach, like creating a community of owners of houses and people that want to rent them. And so that was the initial idea. Over time, that has evolved a little bit with empowering people to build things without code. But I would say not using code to build things was more of a mean than an end for us. It was more, that's the way we're going to empower people to do things. If it had turned out that letting them writing simple code was a better way, maybe we would have gone that route. In fact, a lot of people have in the past tried to make the coding process easier with easier code. What we're seeing now, and what we've said at Bubble for a long time, is that it's just not good enough, and so it can't work. But a lot of people gave it a shot.
Got it. And there was no fear, like, okay, it's the real validation. People want to do this because it's, you're entering something new where the norm is, well, I'm going to have software engineers doing this, right?
No, this is probably the worst way to start a company, but we've never, ever done any kind of like market validation, market sizing, testing whether people would want to use what we built, because what we felt was, look, finding an engineer is difficult. Writing code sucks. It takes a long time. It can bugs. It's like not fun to look at a dark screen with a lot of code. If we can make that process easier, well, of course it's going to work.
Sure.
Like, like how can it not work, right? So the question was like, it's not, are people going to want this? The people was, are we going to be able to create a product that is good enough for people to actually want to use it? And so instead of losing time, because I really think it would have been a waste of time, talking to people to validate whether they wanted to use something like Bubble, we decided, well, the only way to know whether it works is to actually build it and be heads down on the product. And that's what we did. And that's how we ended just being the two of us for 5 years, heads down on the product.
So you had to learn how to code and kind of get back into it to make it
I got back into it, yeah.
Okay.
Josh was a tough but good teacher.
But you guys bootstrap, right?
For till 2019, yes.
Okay, so then on to 2019. So for the 5 years that you guys were getting started,
so it was 7 years actually.
7 years, right? So 7 years, right? How do you guys live? Or did you kind of put an early version out and said, hey, here it is, try it out?
We mostly use our savings, honestly, at first, for the first like 2.5 years or something. And then we found a few customers that were paying us. I took a salary earlier than Josh because I had to, for legal reasons, like not to get too technical, but there is something called the prevailing wage with your H1, with the visa you're having. So I took a salary earlier, and then we fix that between the two of us later once we started making more money as a company. But yeah, it was mostly our savings, cheap lifestyle. Looking back, it was toward the end. I'm not gonna lie, like I started being in a place where I wanted a little bit more comfort with me. I was like 33 or 32 and living with 3 roommates, and I started being to the point where I think I worked hard enough in my life. I'd like to enjoy an apartment for myself.
Yeah.
But the first 2 years of this, 2-3 years, were actually quite enjoyable. Like the frugal lifestyle that was imposed because of that made me feel very connected to the mission that I was setting for myself with the product, with that, and helped me confirm how fundamentally excited I was about solving that problem and passionate I was about this, and that I wasn't there for the money. And in fact, I'm really not there for the money. I mean, obviously, if the company works well, there will be wealth created because it's the internet and this businesses like that scale. But it really was not the point when we started.
Sure. Okay. So why you guys didn't consider racing? I mean, you guys have a good product, something really new, and now you kind of had the edge saying, okay, well, I do. I've been a management consultant. I've made good money. I've got an MBA from Harvard. I could have different things in life, and you know how to speak to business. Why didn't you guys fundraise early on?
Because there are a couple of reasons. There is like business reasons and then the true reason, I guess. The business reason was we didn't feel that we were a business that could have explosive growth for quite some time, because the product needs to be good enough for people to even want to look at it. It takes a very long time to, first of all, create a product that's powerful enough to create something sophisticated without code. I mean, it's a hard problem, like Microsoft has tried for a decade and they still don't have something satisfactory, right? And it's not that they're short on resources. Then you need to convince people it's worth their time. Then you need to teach them and train them, and you're going to lose some people on the way, and your documentation is going to not be good at first, right? Then they need to build something. And after that, once they build something, they show it to their friends, then maybe you can have someone else start that is coming from a friend, right? So it's a very slow process. You could argue that having money speed that up. There are limits to that. And if it were true, then, again, Microsoft would just put $1 billion on the problem and would have crushed us a long time ago, and it hasn't started yet. Or maybe it has, but I'm not aware of it. It's certainly not at where we are in terms of product. So we felt that we were not able to deliver fast growth, and so it would be fairly dangerous to fundraise, because as soon as you fundraise, the clock starts ticking. And sure. At that point, I didn't have a ton of experience in the VC world, but I already started seeing that mechanism happen. And what we saw is some companies that nobody would know now, that were started a year after us, went through the VC route, like traditional VC route. They both did Y Combinator. One of the companies raised from Andreessen Horowitz, the best names of the valley you can think of,
sure.
Ended up going out of business. And I don't, I'm not an insider in these stories, but I'm pretty sure the fact that they fundraised put some pressure in the wrong place in the early on. So that was a business reason. And then the real reason, I would say, is I think there was a little bit of some irreverence from Josh and I that just didn't want to take having people telling us what to do.
I get it.
Enjoy that. And so not fundraising was kind of cool.
No, I get it. I think that's something to consider, right? Because we go through the same a lot. It's like, hey, do we fundraise? Do we not? Do we keep it? Do we keep the company? Do we like kind of having freedom, right? And no.
And the last thing I'd say is that we haven't met people that were truly excited about what we were doing back then. We did not actively fundraise, but through my business school network, when Josh has his own friends that were like pretty well connected with the Valley, we did have conversations from time to time. And maybe we were telling what we were doing terribly, but if that's the case, then what I'm doing now is a terrible job, because it's exactly the same thing that I'm saying now. Really, my speech has not really changed over the years, and people, now investors find that exciting today. But back in 2012, they were not excited by this.
Do you guys do any accelerators or any kind of help, or was just you two guys? Just
us two guys. Yeah.
Wow. 5 years. What was that journey like? So what was it like? Okay, kind of getting.
So it was 5 years, the two of us.
Right.
Then we built a team, but bootstrapped, which got us to 12 people, and then we pulled the trigger on a round 2 years ago.
Got it. Okay. So then at kind of like at which point did you feel, okay, this is something people want. Now we get validation. I've gone long enough and people are actually getting this. We should definitely stick to this and grow it. Or was it just always mission driven? We're going to make it work no matter what? Or
it was always mission driven. That said, I think it's around 2018 when we started feeling that the product was actually pretty strong and ready. Like, not perfect still today, there's still always a lot of things to fix, but now we start having something where, when we make the claim, you can build Twitter without code, we actually can deliver on that. By the way, it's not true for a lot of players, actually. A lot of players vastly exaggerate what you can do with their product. And then we were like, okay, now we can grow faster. We didn't put the trigger on fundraising right away because, at that point we had started hiring people and you're busy and you only have 24 hours a day. So it took probably another 6 months after that to be like, okay, now let's think about fundraising. Then another 2-3 months to plan the process. The fundraising process, though, we were lucky because it went pretty quickly.
Yeah. And what was that judgment like? Were you kind of picking companies that failed, that were kind of close to your heart, that you say, these guys align with me? Was it more like, this is the right opportunity? These guys can have the right setup for us. It's always a tricky process picking the right VC.
It is. We were fortunate to have enough term sheets to do a lot of interviewing. So we talked to a lot of people. We did a ton of reference calls. We called other founders. Obviously, we went for people who believed in what we were doing, but I would say the filter is done early on that one. If people don't believe in what you're doing, you're not going to get a term sheet most of the time. So we end up with 3 firms that were interested in talking, working with us, actively investing in us. I would say all of them were, I think, quite aligned on the mission. But then we talked with firms. And to be fair, we got very positive reviews for all the firms. I think at a certain level, all the firms are pretty good. Marginally, we had better vibes with Signal Fire, and so we went with them.
And was it you interviewing with them, kind of taking the stance of like, hey, I have the price? Or did they flip it and you kind of had to convince them, my company is good, you guys should invest?
It starts more as you have to convince them your company is worth it, right? Because you have more companies pitching than VC firms. That said, at some point, once they start being interested, and more importantly, once a second firm start being interesting, then it flips, and then they are the one pitching you. It's a pretty natural evolution.
Cool, gotcha. Okay, then now you guys have a company. You guys are hiring the 5-year segment of kind of you guys building, which is insane, by the way. Has passed. What was the first hire? Who was the first person you guys said, okay, we need help now?
It was engineers.
Okay.
Pretty traditionally.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. And then following that up, when you said, okay, once you kind of guys hit 12, now it feels like it's a company, right? From then on, kind of what does it go? Yeah. From then on, what was that like? Where does it go? Because now you're okay, let's just hire more people. Let's get this going. Let's get this rocket ship, but you're kind of losing grip of that close knit that you had, that is just you two guys.
No, we only a little bit less than 40 people now. It's still pretty close. 40 people, certainly, especially as founders. At 12 people, we used to interact with everyone. Now, with 40 people, it's a bit tougher, but I would argue it's more of a COVID thing than a scale thing, honestly. It's just being all remote is a little bit tougher. But that said, I'm pretty sure when we have 200 people, it's going to be I will look back at 40 saying wow, good old times. So.
Yeah. And at this rate, when do you guys feel like it's 200? Are you guys going to continue now raising or?
We'll see. Probably, I would say. I think now we are, the kind of business that if money is used wisely, money can accelerate growth tremendously in a very positive way, which again, I don't think was the case 8 years ago. And so given how much resources there are in the market, to be clear, how much cash there is in the market, I think we can probably find ways to use some in a good way that just benefits the mission better.
Sure. I think, well, even man, I didn't come from no code. I didn't see no code. I was just building a company. I needed help and I just found tools that I needed. But Bubble was just something that was just always there that I just couldn't ignore. That even if I didn't know what it was just kind of coming, oh, you have to use this. I think that was one of our first partners was getting Bubble without even knowing what it was. So just to talk, like, hey, it's coming out there. I think it's hard to ignore these days. And now what's going on, people trying to start companies. It's just you guys are so well positioned for the future to come.
Yep, I hope so.
Yeah, so do I. Cool. Okay. Then what are some of the lessons that you would say were really something you learned along the way that kind of shaped you to be who you are today and kind of take the company to where it is right now?
Well, there are a lot of questions here.
Let's focus on like, okay, what's one lesson that you would say, man, like there's one thing I can really teach to people that I would like, that I taught me a lot, right, in this journey of entrepreneurship, which is what bubbles are like, that will really help others.
I guess one lesson will be whatever you're trying to do as an entrepreneur is going to be harder than you think.
100%.
And it's okay, but be prepared. It's going to be harder and longer, which I mean, and I think we're doing very well. I'm very happy where we are today, but it's been 9 years. It's been a very long time. And when you look at other people in our space, some of them got bigger with larger financing rounds lately. But when you look at how big they are, actually, it's still pretty small compared to Uber, which was started the same year as we were. And Uber was hard for other reasons. My point being, building something like a complex tool like Bubble is a difficult endeavor and takes a very long time. And that I did not necessarily expect that at first. Like I wouldn't say, I guess I did underestimate how hard it was, and that's one of the lessons. And then I could get from an entrepreneurial level, which is kind of related. Like one lesson I figured for us, which is not obvious and a little bit contrarian to what a lot of people say. And I want to preface by saying that because it's not necessarily something that would apply to every business out there. But I would urge people not to launch too soon. Like people say, you should launch your business as soon as possible and get it live to get feedback. I think that's the important part, get feedback. Sure. So for us, for instance, we had our first paying customers, and they even paid us by check because at that time we didn't have like the implementation to take credit cards through Stripe in December 2012. So as super early, and at that time the product was, you have no idea how ugly that was and how limited it was. And so we had feedback extremely early with engaged users that were using us seriously and paying. But I would consider our first public launch in September or October 2015, so fairly late actually on Product Hunt. And I think it turned out to be a good thing for us because we could make actually the best of the opportunity, and that's what really put us on the map. And today we're here today because of that launch in October 2015. I mean, not only, but it certainly helped a ton. And I often see people starting companies launching too soon at a time where they can't get as much value from the launch as they could have. Sure. So my advice is to wait a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Now I want to kind of focus on product. How does Emmanuel Straschnov see the world? What do you think in like 5 years, 10 years from now, knowing what you know, and you're just so immersed in this, do you foresee now kind of like a shift coming and like, hey, we're going to stop hiring just normal software engineers, maybe still kind of have some like data scientists and AI driven, but you're going to see more like a focus of like, hey, just simple no coding tools, just visual language stuff?
I think more and more the world is going to turn into like the development world. Like here, sure. Let's be specific, right? I don't want to start thinking about, I mean, I can, but my opinions may not be as relevant. The software development world, I think we're going to start, seeing hardcore engineers and no coders, or in Bubble, you call them bubblers, start forming a blend a little bit. And it's going to be a little bit more and more unclear who's actually writing code and who's not writing code, and they work together on some projects. And so what I hope that means in practice is that 5 to 10 years from now, every company that needs to build something will assess how to build that, looking at the different tools that exist. And that probably for 80% of the needs will stick to a no-code tool, which at that point should not be called no-code. It's just going to be the way to build, that's a tool. Yeah. And if they need to extend the platform and add some features, or if there is something that Bubble hopefully is not the best at, then they will bring engineers on board to code that, to extend the platform with some code. So engineers are not going to go away. Companies will still hire engineers, just much less of them. And what's truly exciting about this is that then engineers will only start working on new problems. one of the biggest tragedies today, honestly, and when I mean tragedy, I actually mean it, because we don't know what they could do if they have time. But when you see there's so much money today going in startups that looked like each other a ton from a technical standpoint. Like look at Lyft and Uber, amazing companies, but what's the difference between the two technically, right? One is pink, the other one is black. But at the end of the day, it's fundamentally the same product, right? And they have thousands of engineers. What at a time where the need for software could improve things in any field, really, not just like consumer tech, right? Healthcare, environment totally shows like better code could do so much good things if used wisely. And we see most of the smart, capable talent being focused on consumer tech because that's where the money is, or like enterprise tech. Makes me very sad. I think it's just a waste of resource allocation. Like it's just wrong. And it goes into solving problems that are not necessarily the most important problems to solve. And so what I'm hoping, what that gets us 10 years from now, sooner than that, hopefully 5 years from now, is in enterprise companies like Lyft and Uber, or like any of these, will stop using that many engineers because they're not necessary anymore. They'll use something like Bubble. They'll have a few engineers because you might want to write a better algorithm than your competitor to match riders and drivers, for instance, But then all these engineers that will be not working at these companies can finally work on like truly innovative problems. And don't get me wrong, I mean, some still do at these companies, but there is a lot of reinventing the wheel going on currently at those companies because there is a need in the market, and so there is no alternative to build things. Well, it turns out that there is one, and it's just about us to make it bigger. But when you think about the impact of no code, people think, we're empowering, creators to create more things. 100%, and that's highly exciting and really something I want to keep pushing. But there is a secondary effect that might even be more important, which is we're going to free engineering time to actually work on real problems. And I found that particularly exciting.
Okay, for sure. A few questions that came from this. One, really brief. Can an Airbnb, Uber, Lyft be built on Bubble right now?
Yes. I'm not a bullshitter, so we don't put things on our website. Like, I actually think one of the most important things that I can do as a founder of a company like Bubble that lets people create things is to be very clear and upfront about what you can do and can't do, because people will find out if you lie, and then you reinforce the skepticism that even though no code is cool today, and you guys are doing No Code Week and there are other events happening, there is still a lot of skepticism from the technical world about technologies like this. Yes, feature-wise, as long as we're talking as a website, a web platform. So Uber, it's a little bit harder because it's native and it's not something we do. So I'll focus on Airbnb.com, right?
Yeah.
Functionality-wise, yes, there is very little that Bubble can do today, including customizing prices to some circumstances that might require a little bit of code. So today I can't think of many things that Bubble can do. Where I'm not going to say yes, and I want to be explicit, is the scale. Like, if you were to have overnight a company as big as Airbnb on Bubble today, the servers would probably crash. Now, the good news is that it's unlikely to happen, and that's something that there's no point for us to build for Airbnb scale when our users are not Airbnb yet, right? So this is something we work over time to just make sure we scale nicely with our users. What's exciting, though, and honestly revolutionary, like no other team in the world has achieved that so far. And that's something I'm extremely proud of what we're doing at Bubble, is we've pushed the limits of what you can do without code further than any other team. And we can make the claim that you can build Airbnb functionality-wise without code. And there's no other tool on the market that will let you do that.
Phenomenal. I feel something like this will just explode in the emerging markets. Like I'm in Colombia, right? That's one of the things where
we're very high on. Usually we don't share, too much of revenue numbers, but that one I can share that only 40% of our revenue is from the US.
Okay, right.
Which I don't know other startups numbers, but from what I'm hearing, it's definitely much higher. So Brazil is a very strong country for us. There is a very active community. India is very active. I think we have users in more like 120 or 30 countries now. So the reason is emerging markets don't necessarily have the infrastructure to train engineers. Sure. And so it's actually an even bigger problem there. like the shortage of engineers. Strangely enough, is a bigger problem in Africa than it is in Silicon Valley. And so, yes, there's definitely something to do in emerging markets.
Got it. Okay. And now another question. I'm learning so much from you. Do you guys foresee then kind of taking the route of, hey, I want to take Bubble as far as like in the future, right? SpaceX can build on Bubble, right? And kind of going in a complexity route that like, hey, we're going to make it more and more rich. Or more like, hey, can we focus on the bigger markets, consumer-led, just the easy stuff that people are going to be able to use, or just both?
I mean, of course you want to say both, but in practice, you kind of have to choose a focus.
Okay.
And to that question, then our response is fairly clear. We don't necessarily want to add complexity. I don't think we need to, but we want to make sure we create a product that can scale and that people can keep using to become the next Airbnb. That doesn't mean we won't do things to make the product easier to learn, and we have a couple of projects going on right now to make that happen. But I feel like we're at the point now where we reach a certain sweet spot. Bubble is certainly not the easiest product to learn, but we've proven with enough thousands of people that if people are motivated, they can learn. Mm-hmm. And so there are two ways to solve that. Certainly, we can improve things to make it easier to use and learn. Actually, I wouldn't say easier to use. I think the feedback we're getting from our experienced users is once you know how to use it, it's actually fairly easy. Meaning you don't need to click in too many places. Like it's actually pretty efficient as an interface. You can do a lot with very few clicks, but you need to know how to use it. And so then the question is, can we make it easier to learn? So there's certainly a ton of stuff we can do to make it easier to learn on the product, on the documentation, but there is also evangelization part to this. If, people actually trusted me when I say, and the problem is that if I say it, people may not believe me. So it's even better when users say it. If people trusted me when I say, hey, it's going to take you 10 hours or 20 hours or 30 hours of learning, but then you're going to have the same powers as a software engineer, then people will just go through it because 30 hours is nothing. Sure. It is a lot if you're not sure what you're going to do with it. Yeah, I don't have 30 hours to spend, but you have to compare that not with what you could do in 1 hour and play. You have to compare that with spending, 4 or 5 years of computer science training, right? And if you put that in that regard, it's nothing. So that's why investing in making sure we have success stories on our platform is so important. Because if we get the next billion-dollar company that goes public and it's a bubble-powered startup, then suddenly, everybody will know that, wow, shit, this guy built he doesn't have engineers and he built like $1 billion startup, really? And then suddenly we won't have any problem and people won't say Bubble is too hard to learn, So it's a lot of a reputation issue. So that's why I think it's much more promising to work that way instead of trying to simplify the product to the point where you can't do too much. Because the other thing I will say is, sorry, but there's no free lunch, Like if you want freedom to create anything you want, the product at some point you will be making mistakes because it's open-ended, and you will have to fix your mistakes, and you might get frustrated. And that's where, the learning curve can be painful at times. The problem with the learning curve is not that you have to watch videos, right? People complain about the learning curve because they can't figure out what they did wrong and they need to go back, and right? That, unfortunately, we'll do whatever we can to shorten that learning curve. Yeah. But again, there's no free lunch. If you want open-endedness, if you want to be able to do whatever you want on the web, you're going to have to learn the tool.
Sure. Cool. We have a question from our community. Do you consider Bubble to be a community-first led company?
Yeah, community first. It's very community-driven. First, I don't know, because it started with a product, so some people would say we're product first, community first. At the end of the day, we're a product before being a community. But the community is extremely important to us, yes. Gotcha. It was almost like it's a little bit a consequence of our bootstrapping history where, so for 5 years, it was just the two of us. I was the one in charge of building the product while Josh was building our infrastructure. And in addition to that, I had to deal with customer success. So I was receiving all the incoming bug reports, complaints, and everything. And at some point, it was just becoming non-manageable. And so I started a community for people to help each other. And so that's the forum that we still have today. If you go to forum.bubble.io, that's something that I started in June 2015. And then there kind of was some kind of a contract, with the community was, I'm not going to answer your emails that much. As a company, we're not going to answer your emails, but you guys help each other. Experienced bubblers help the new one. The new one don't expect us to have a support team that can email you within 2 hours. But on the flip side, in return, we're going to keep heads down on the product and build a great product. And if you guys hit some dead ends that are really getting in your way, we figured a way to remove them. And so that's how we started. And still today, it's still very much the spirit. And that has turned out to be a very valuable asset for the company.
Gotcha. There's one thing I forgot to ask. Didn't come to mind as you were saying it. But once you started selling and like letting people use Bubble, what kind of business, what kind of projects are people building with this? What was like the first thing that you saw? Like the first customer that went and built something, what did they build?
The very first customer that paid us, that sent us a check, was like this check I mentioned. I actually have a picture of the check.
Yeah.
We cashed it in though, because at that time I certainly wanted to cash it in. They were building like a financial literacy platform. So it was a platform where people could share tips, advice, and lessons about how to manage your personal finances.
Okay.
And a lot of videos, so it was deeply integrated with YouTube, where people would upload to YouTube. So I guess today it would not necessarily make sense anymore, because I think a YouTube channel might be enough. But back then in 2012, you didn't have YouTube channels. So it was something on top of YouTube, basically, but as a web app, and people could comment. So a very simple web app, but something that would require engineers to build.
Gotcha. And are there any customers now today that you're like really proud of, like looking like, man, this is really exciting what they're building on Bubble? Do you guys keep track of?
I mean, honestly, it's going to sound cheesy, but I can't say all of them, but many, many of them. We've seen people doing extremely successful things on us. Some of them being successful, like kind of the type A traditional entrepreneur, raising money, scaling quickly. Like we have a company in Paris currently doing more than 4 million euros of AR on Bubble, for instance, and they're planning to double this year. So we've seen these kind of situations. We also have, and then we have people who do nonprofit work that is actually something to be very proud of. Like people that use their Bubble skill to create software in places where software would never be used because it's just too expensive and there's no market to address. Like someone once reached out to me like a few months ago, didn't know I was French, so wrote in English, but it turns out he was French. Telling me that he used Bubble to build a portal for pregnant women who were single and needed help to deal with their pregnancy because of COVID. They couldn't do the gatherings anymore. How cool is that? That will never make a dime. That thing will never make money. But that's really what Bubble is about. Bubble is about making sure that when there is an opportunity to improve the situation with technology, whether it's for free or on a nonprofit basis, they can. And I think it's one of the coolest things you can imagine as a founder, getting emails like this.
Yeah, and have you seen anything where you're like, man, these guys are really pushing the boundaries of what Bubble can do?
Less today, I think, because now we've added enough features. But in the early year, or maybe I don't see them anymore, because I think we have like close to 1 million apps now, so it's
Wow.
It's a lot. But a few years ago, especially when I was doing Success myself, it would happen sometimes that I was like, wow, how did this guy? Is that a Bubble app? And I had to actually look at the console to make sure it was one.
Cool. Well, I think we're reaching out there at the end of the time. Any parting words, wishes, any last advice you want to give it out there through our members and to your communities also watching?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I mean, it's always great to be able to talk to the community. It's something that as the company, as it gets bigger, we lose that a little bit naturally, and so I'm always very fond of opportunities like this to be able to talk with the community. I want to thank everyone for their support. I don't know if Bubble is a community-first company or not, but what I'm sure is that we wouldn't be here without the community of people who are either telling their friends about it, because if I make a speech here, you will all say, he's just selling his thing. If you tell to your friend, I built that and believe me, it works, 100% that will convert, and 100% you will convert that person to this to the no-code movement, and Bubble in particular. So I want to thank everyone on that. And we have exciting things coming up for everyone. So I'm really hoping, I think the next 18 months will be pretty transformational for the no-code space and Bubble in particular. I think we have an opportunity to really turn this movement, which is an early adopter movement so far, into what I really think a household name that will keep having the impact that I just mentioned with this little portal for pregnant women. And I'm really looking forward to do that together with everyone.
Cool. Well, no. Thank you much for joining us. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, man.
It was great being here.
Yeah, cool. Until next time.
Bye.
Bye. And thank you all of you guys for joining us again for No Code Week Founder Stories. That was Emmanuel Straschnov from Bubble. Want to remind you guys that we offer a $2,000 discount off for Bubble through Startup Starter through our partnership. So if you haven't joined, please join us on Startup Starter. We're a smart community for startups, investors, and service providers doing big things. Thank you for joining us again, and we'll see you soon. Stay tuned for tomorrow, our networking session. And then next week, we have Typeform, Airtable, Software, and a bunch of other really good companies. So we'll see you then. Ciao.